This is Americana Autoharp. Autoharps are technically in the zither family of instruments, but what makes them especially unique is their chord bars. Now all the chord bars do is mute any notes outside of the currently selected chord. So right now I have C major selected, and then if I click and drag on the strings that are in the Autoharp graphic in the interface, you'll hear any notes outside of that chord get muted. And then you can change between the chords by clicking on the different chord buttons on the interface. Now, as you can hear, when I switched from the G major chord to the C major chord, the common chord tones were allowed to ring throughout that transition, just like what would happen on a real Autoharp. Now, in addition to manually selecting the chords by clicking on the buttons on the interface, you can also use the key switches that are at the bottom of the keyboard. Now, those are mapped according to the setting in this drop-down menu here, and you have different options for different keys, which map the chords diatonically, or you can just make all of the chord buttons, which is all 21 available chords, mapped to the bottom 3 octaves of your MIDI keyboard. So in the first octave, you have all of the major chords, and then dominant 7 chords in the second octave, and finally all of the minor chords in that third octave. Now that might be fine if you're planning on sequencing the instrument in your DAW, using maybe the piano roll or something like that. But if you plan on recording live from your MIDI keyboard, I think you'll find that using one of the keys and just having a single octave of diatonic chords is a lot more convenient. So in addition to all of the chord buttons, you also have a no chord button right here, which basically is the equivalent of lifting all of the chord buttons on the Autoharp and allowing all of the strings to ring like that. So that's useful in certain situations, like if you want to just pluck individual strings, that could be helpful. So now let's talk about the different options that are available at the bottom of the interface. Starting with the muted volume knob right here, what this allows you to do is adjust the volume of just the muted strings. As you may have noticed, those muted strings kind of add up and they can make the Autoharp sound kind of scratchy. So if you want to get a cleaner sound, you can always reduce the sound of the muted strings. Here's what it sounds like by default. And then if I turn down the sound of the muted strings, and then I'll turn it back up. So you'll find that some amount of those muted strings really helps with the realism of the Autoharp. But like I said before, if it ends up sounding a little too scratchy for what you're after, you can always reduce the volume of those muted strings using that control. Next, there's the stereo width control, and that just allows you to adjust the overall width of the stereo field. So by default, it's a pretty natural width, but you can always make it a wider mix by increasing this knob here. Or you can make it narrower. All the way down to being completely mono. Okay, let's bring it back to the default setting. Now let's take a look at the different options for strumming. So this first control allows you to select between different types of strums. That could be anything from just single strings to a pinch strum, which is a motion where you're using your thumb and fingers to sort of making a pinch motion, to an upward strum, and finally a downward strum. So let's listen to what those different types sound like. Here's the single strings. Okay, now here's the pinch motion. Just upward. And downward. You can switch between the different strum types dynamically by right-clicking on this knob and using the built-in MIDI Learn option to assign it to a MIDI CC, or you can use these key switches that are mapped above the main playing range to instantly jump between the different strum type options. So on the topic of the single strum type, where you're just plucking single strings, that's really the most useful if you select the no chord option here. So all the chord buttons on the Autoharp are lifted, making all of the strings available to ring. And that way you can pretty much play the Autoharp like a harp. Okay, so at this point, I should mention the first knob to the left right here, which is it sets a threshold for a velocity, and if you play a note with a velocity under that threshold, it will mute that currently ringing string rather than plucking it. And that way you can play stuff like this. So that's really helpful if you want to approach the instrument more like a harp instead of using the chord buttons. Okay, let's address the remaining two strum options here, which the first one here you can adjust is the speed of the strum. I'm going to go back to a pinch strum. So if you want to make that strum slower, you can use this control here. And I should mention that the speed of the strum is still modulated by the velocity of the note too, so it's just sort of the general speed of the strum. Or I can increase it to make it faster. Okay, and then finally you can adjust the length of the strums. And that allows you to have it strum more strings. Or you can decrease the knob to strum fewer strings. So as with the speed of the strums, the length of the strums is also modulated by the velocity of the notes, and that's what helps make it feel more dynamic to play from your MIDI keyboard. I'll play the Autoharp a little more so you can get a better sense for how the sample library sounds. I'm using the main playing range, these blue keys here, to strum the strings, and then using the key switch below that range to change between the chords. Thanks for watching this video. You can listen to audio demos and get your own copy of Americana Autoharp from the Orange Tree Samples website.